Yes, Roy, good evening. Arun, good evening. Rama, good evening. Dev, yes, good evening, everybody. So, this is welcome to this masterclass on database management system. So, basically, this is going to be a 30 days masterclass. So, firstly, I'm going to discuss with you about what do you mean by DBMS. What is database management system? I'm going to explain you briefly about some concepts in DBMS. And then I'm going to give you a brief introduction to SQL. What do you mean by structured query language? So how to insert records, delete records. And then I will be discussing with you about MongoDB. So if possible, I will explain some concepts and I will show you some implementation examples. So this is what we are going to see in this 30 days masterclass. So firstly, what do you mean by DBMS? Yes, good evening everybody. Aditya, good evening. Deepthi, good evening. Lakshmi, good evening. Yes, database management system. So basically, what do you mean by DBMS? What do you mean by database management system? So welcome to this masterclass on DBMS. What do you mean by DBMS? So it refers to the technology storage. So whenever we are going to develop any kind of application, for example, if it can be a web application or some other type of application, yes, database management system. So storage, it plays a very important step. So from the term you can just understand what do you mean by DBMS, database management system. So it refers to the technology of storing and retrieving the user's data. So I'm going to, for example, you can consider, so today everything is becoming online. You can imagine an online restaurant management system, or you can imagine a hospital management system. Yes. So it's used to store the data, it is used to retrieve the data, so updation, whatever I want to do, so I can do this. So with utmost security, so everything is going to be online. So a proper definition, so it refers to the technology of storing and retrieving users' data along with security measures. So this is what is called as DBMS, Database Management System. So basically I am giving you a brief introduction. What do you mean by DBMS? Yes, store and how to retrieve the data. So what do you mean by DBMS? Basically I just gave you a brief introduction to DBMS. My voice is echoing. Yeah, once you register for internship, you will be getting all these PPTs. SQL, I will just discuss. Firstly, I am going to discuss with you about DBMS concepts. And then I will be discussing with you about SQL and what do you mean by MongoDB. So I'm going to develop how to build some applications. So why we have to go for this DBMS? Basically, I just gave you a brief introduction to database management system. So why we have to learn DBMS? So basically data was organized in file formats. Clear with this? So whenever I want to store any data, so everything is stored as a file. For example, I want to store in a corporate company, I want to collect employee records and it should be stored securely in the database. Yes? Or you can consider a restaurant management system, a hospital management system, SQL versus MongoDB. So MongoDB, no structured database, global storage. So whereas SQL local host, I will be discussing with you about all these things. So why we have to learn this DBMS, database management system? So what makes this technology so very powerful? Yeah, the data will be Guru Sai, good answer. So real world entity. So DBMS is more realistic and it uses real world entities to design its architecture. Clear with this? For example, whenever I want to show some employee record, so I am going to create some tables. So everything is stored in the form of rows and columns. Tabular data structure. So how I'm going to organize my data? So whenever I want to store something, say for example, whenever I want to store some employee records, or if I want to store some student records, you can consider any online website. So for example, if I want to store some employee records, or if I want to store some, you can consider a student management system. If I want to store some student records, you can consider a hospital. For example, if I want to store some patient records, yes, it is used to store data and retrieve the data. So everything, I am going to create a table and I am going to store the data in a secured manner. For example, a school database in an academic institution. So everything, so for example, whenever you have something, whenever I'm going to develop something, so all my records should be stored securely in the database. For example, a school database. So it may use students as an entity and their age as an attribute. Entity, what do you mean by entity? A standalone class, a table. So each and every class, for example, I can consider students as an entity. Clear with this? So what do you mean by this students? So it is called as an entity, a separate class or a table. So for example, whenever I am collecting in an academic institution, I am going to collect the students' records. It should be stored securely in the database. And it has age as an attribute. Clear with this? A school database. I can consider a school database. So it may use students as an entity and their age as an attribute. So real world entity. So you can imagine, for example, in a hospital management system. So whenever I'm going to create some hospital database and there will be a patient's entity. So I want to store some, I'm going to collect some patient records and it should be stored securely in the database. So I can consider them as patient's entity. Patients as an entity. So what are all the major features? So what makes this technology so very powerful? So why I have to go for this database management system? Firstly, I just gave you a brief introduction to DBMS. So I'm just discussing the reasons why I have to learn this technology. First one is the real world entity. Second one is the relation based tables. So what do you mean by this relation based tables? For example, it allows entities and relations among them to form tables. So each and every entity, you can consider any entity. So it allows entities and relations among them to form tables, relation based tables. For example, you can consider each and every class, it is represented as an entity in the database. So it allows entities and relations among them to form tables. So as I was telling you, right, so what is the data structure? How I am going to store my data in the form of tables or tabular data structure. Clear with this? So user can understand the architecture of the database just by looking at the table names. For example, in a hospital, so what are the different tables I have? I have an patient table in order to store the patient records, and then I'm going to have some doctors table in order to store the doctors records, and still what are the other tables that are present in a database. So isolation of data and application. So it's entirely different than its data. So data, for example, whenever I'm going to work with database, it's all about data. So what are all the major reasons why I have to learn this DBMS, Database Management System? Less redundancy. So whenever I have some unwanted data, so through some mathematical process, scientific process, I am going to reduce the data redundancy, less redundancy. So unwanted data. So instead of storing the same data repeatedly, so data redundancy will be reduced. So all these are the major reasons why I have to go for this DBMS, Database Management System. Consistency. So each and every relation in a database, it remains consistent. For example, DBMS, it can provide greater consistency as compared to earlier forms of data storing applications like file processing systems. Query language. Clear with this? So all these are the major features. So why I have to go for this structured query language. So what do you mean by this query language? So what makes this DBMS? Whenever I'm going to query the database, how I'm going to communicate or interact with the database? So whenever I'm going to query the database, for example, what are the different operations that can be performed whenever I want to create some database? Or if I want to create tables, insert records. So it's equipped with the query language. It makes it more efficient to retrieve and manipulate data. Clear with this? So all these are the major features. Why I have to learn this DBMS, Database Management System. What are all the major reasons? What makes this technology so very powerful? I gave you a brief introduction to DBMS. I am just telling you the reasons why I have to learn this technology. So the first one is real world entity. So each and every entity, it is going to be represented as a separate class in the database table. For example, I can consider a student class or I can consider a patient class, real world entities. And relation based tables. So I'm going to store all the records, data or records in the form of tables, and I'm going to establish some relations among the tables. So isolation of data and application. Less redundancy. So all these are the major features why I have to go for this DBMS, Database Management System. Consistency. Clear with this? So I'm going to store some consistent data. So database remains constant. So consistency is a state where every relation in a database remains constant. So I just gave you some brief introduction to DBMS. So isolation of data, for example, whenever I want to store some data in the database, so it can be stored securely in the database. So I'm going to separate the data. For example, I'm collecting some patient records. So I'm going to fetch the data present in various fields and it will be stored securely in the database. So I just gave you some introduction to DBMS. What do you mean by database management system? Yes, I can perform different types of operations. When I'm going to discuss with you about structured query language, so I'm going to discuss with you about different types of operations. Clear with this? Isolation of data and application. So what I'm trying to say is I'm going to extract the data whenever I'm developing any application. I didn't say isolation of data alone. So isolation of data and application. So whenever I'm going to develop any web application, so I'm going to extract the data. You can consider I'm going to collect some employee records or I'm going to collect some patient records. I'm going to separate the data and it will be stored securely in the database. Clear with this? RDBMS, Relational Database Management System. So there will be a relationship between the tables. So whenever I'm going to develop some bigger applications, I have to go for RDBMS concepts. Yes, Archana, you can perform. Yes, I will provide you notes. I will share my PPTs as well. So once you register for internship, you can receive all my PPTs and whatever I am discussing. So I just gave you some introduction to DBMS, why I have to go for this. Next I am going to discuss with you about the applications of DBMS, Database Management System. So a database is a collection of related data. So data, what do you mean by data? The world is evolving around data towards AI. So machine learning, AI. So what do you mean by data? Data is nothing but a collection of facts and figures. So it can be processed to produce some meaningful information. Clear with this? For example, whenever I am going for an academic institution, so I can consider them as a student data. Or in a hospital management system, so you can consider them as a patient data. Whenever a data is nothing but a collection of facts and figures. So it represents recordable facts. So it aids in producing information. It is based on facts. So how I'm going to establish, how I'm going to store some records in the database. For example, I have some data about marks obtained by students. So only when I have some data, I can conclude, I can decide something out of my data. I can conclude about toppers and average marks of the students obtained by the student in different departments. Clear with this? So all these are the different applications, database management system. So what do you mean by this DBMS? It is going to store data in such a way that it becomes easier to retrieve, manipulate and produce information. So whenever I want to retrieve data or if I want to produce some information, I can go for this DBMS, database management system. Clear with this? So each and every, whenever I am going to interact with the database, it is called as a transaction. So multi-user and concurrent access. So all these are the different applications of DBMS. For example, as I was telling you, right, you can consider a hospital website or you can consider a restaurant. So everything is becoming online, an e-commerce website. For example, Amazon, Flipkart. So each and every day a huge amount of transactions are happening. So it supports multi-user environment. So as the volume of data is going to increase, I need to collect the data and it should be stored securely in the database. So when large number of users are going to come in, they are going to access and manipulate the data in parallel. So it supports multi-user environment. So all these are the different applications of DBMS, database management system. Clear with this? So multi-user and concurrent access. So it supports multi-user environment and allows them to access and manipulate data in parallel. So all these are the different applications of DBMS, database management system. And multiple views. So what do you mean by multi-user? For example, many people, they are trying to make some transactions. You can consider Amazon, Flipkart. So whenever they are going to make some transactions, so all the data will be collected and it will be stored securely in the database. So it supports multi-user environment. And still, what are the other applications of DBMS? Multiple views. So it offers multiple views for different users. So a user who is in the sales department, he will have a different view of the database than a person working in the production department. So in a bigger corporate company, you have different departments. So it is going to offer multiple views for different users. So whenever a person from a sales department, he is logging in, so he will be able to see what is the total sales or annual sales. So the sales related information will be displayed. Or whenever a person from some other department, he is logging in. So it offers multiple views for different users. And there is one more important application, security. So what are all the different applications or you can say features? So security. So why I require this DBMS? Why I have to collect all my data and it should be stored securely in the database. So data will not be lost. So it contains some important, that is whenever I am going to collect some employee records or patient records. So all the records will be collected. So it provides it offers some methods to impose constraints. So whenever I want to enter some data into the database and retrieve them, clear with this? So all these are the different applications or you can see features of DBMS. Security. So whenever I am going to store something in the database in a secured manner, so nobody can easily hack them. Clear with this? Whereas in case of traditional storage, so whenever I am going to save something, so it can be easily lost. So all these are the different features. So what makes this technology so very powerful? So till this part, whatever I am speaking, everything is clear. Any doubts so far? If you are interested, you can go to InstaMojo and you can register for DBMS Masterclass program, DBMS MC. This is the coupon code. Once you register for the internship, you will be getting access to the PPTs, the recorded videos, the project files, how the projects are being developed. You will be gaining more practical knowledge. Once you attend this masterclass for 25 days, you will be receiving a free webinar certificate. And the internship users, they will be receiving an internship certificate as well as a participation certificate. If you are interested, you can go to InstaMojo and you can register for DBMS internship program, DBMS MC. This is the coupon code. Once you register for the internship, you will be getting access to the PPTs, the recorded videos, the project files, how the projects are being developed. You will be gaining more practical knowledge. Once you attend this masterclass for 25 days, you will be receiving a free webinar certificate. And the internship users, they will be receiving an internship certificate as well as a participation certificate. Clear with this? So the discounted fee comes around 999 rupees. So you will be getting the 30 days live session. So what is the benefits? And you can access my records, 90 days access to the records. So you can download all my PPTs. Clear with this? So what do you mean by DBMS? So I just gave you some brief introduction to DBMS. So till this part, whatever I am speaking, everything is clear. Any doubts so far? So I just discussed with you about what do you mean by database management system and why I have to go for this technology. So what makes this technology? So without database, so we can't store anything. I will explain asset properties. So I just gave you some introduction. So if possible, I will explain. Whatever I can explain, I will just explain. So what are all the prerequisites? So in order to learn this technology, I require primary memory, secondary memory, data structures and algorithms. So all these are the different prerequisites in order to learn this technology. So let me just, I just gave you some brief overview. So what do you mean by this relation based tables, isolation of data and application? I just discussed with you about this consistency. So all these are the different characteristics of modern DBMS. So query language. So this is one important characteristic of a DBMS, database management system. So what do you mean by this query language? So I can easily interact with the database. What do you mean by SQL? So SQL stands for structured query language. So whenever I want to create some tables or if I want to insert some records, I can easily interact with the database. So asset properties. So it follows the concept of atomicity, consistency, isolation and durability. So whenever I am going to carry out any transaction, so as I was telling you, right, when I am going to store anything in the database, I am going to discuss with you about SQL. What do you mean by structured query language and MongoDB as well? So these concepts are applied on transaction. So whenever I am going to store anything in the database, for example, I am having some e-commerce industry. So whenever I want to store some customer records, a customer is logging in, he is making some transaction. So in a multi-transactional environment, so why I have to go for this asset property, atomicity, consistency, isolation and durability. So consistent, so whenever I'm going to store some data, there should be some consistency if there is any failure in a multi-transactional environment. So you can consider a banking, online banking website. So each and every day a large amount of people, a huge volume of data is being generated. So I need to securely, so consistency, isolation. So whenever in a multi-transactional environment, so what is the use of this? I need the database, it helps the database to stay healthy. So in order to improve the robustness of the database, I need all these properties. Clear with this? So I'm just giving you a brief overview, multi-user access. So when a lot of transactions are happening, when multiple users are logging in, so they will be able to log in. So all these are the different properties, multiple views and security. So all these, for example, you can imagine. So this is one more important characteristic. So who are all the different people? Whenever a transaction is happening, so whenever I want to store some records, who are all the different people that are involved here? So there will be an administrator, so there will be a designer and an end user. So what is the role of an administrator? So there will be all these different users or people involved in a DBMS. So whenever they are going to make some transactions, so what is the role of an administrator? They are going to maintain the DBMS, database management system. They are the people who are responsible for administrating the database. So they act like a central controller. So whenever I am going to talk with you about DBMS, database management system, there should be an administrator. So he acts like a controller. For example, each and every day a large amount of transactions are happening. So whenever I'm going to create some tables, I'm going to insert some records, the administrator person, so he needs to maintain the DBMS and they are responsible for administrating the database. So they are responsible to look after the usage and by whom it should be used. Clear with this? For example, so they create access profiles for users and they apply limitations. So administrators, they also look after DBMS resources like system license, required tools, and other software and hardware related maintenance. So all these are the different characteristics of modern. That is, I am saying who are all the different people. So whenever I am having any database management system, there should be a person, he needs to maintain the database. So he acts like a central controller. There should be an administrator and there will be a designer. So what is the role of these people, designers? What they are going to do? They are the group of people who actually work on the designing part of the database. So they keep a close watch on what data should be kept and in what format. Clear with this? So whenever I am going to deal with a DBMS, so they keep a close watch on what data should be kept and in what format. So whenever I am going to store some data in the database, so they should be stored in some specific format. Clear with this? So they are going to identify and design the whole set of entities, relations, constraints and views. Designers people. And end users. So whenever I am going to store something, for example, if I am going to store some patient records or if I want to store some student records, so they should be stored in some specific format. So what is the role of these designers? They actually work on the designing part of the database. And there will be a end user. So what they are going to do, they actually reap the benefits of having a DBMS. They can range from simple viewers. They can be a business analyst, the end users. They actually reap the benefits. For example, whenever I'm having some patient details, doctor details, so if you're going to log into a hospital, so there will be all these other different people who are involved in using this DBMS, database management system. So clear with this? So till this part, I just gave you some brief introduction to DBMS. What do you mean by DBMS? Why I have to go for this? So who are all the different people that are involved here? So next I am going to discuss with you about architecture. So the DBMS, so it depends on the architecture. It can be a centralized or decentralized architecture. So I have different types. For example, it can be seen, the architecture can be seen as a single tier or a multi-tier or n-tier. So what do you mean by this one-tier architecture? So all these are the different types of architecture. So basically you should understand what is happening inside. So far I just gave you some brief introduction to this technology, why I have to go for the DBMS. So next I'm going to discuss with you about this in detail. So in one-tier architecture, so DBMS is the only entity where the user directly sits on the DBMS and he uses it. So they are nothing but the people or the end users. Clear with this? For example, it does not provide, for example, if I am logging in, I am a common man or a common person. So whenever a person he wants to log in, so he wants to see a history of what all the transactions that are happening in an e-commerce website, you can imagine. So it is called as a single tier architecture. So DBMS is the only entity where the user directly sits on the DBMS and he is going to use it. So there is one more, all these are the different types of architecture. So if the architecture of DBMS is two-tier. So what do you mean by a single tier architecture? There is one more type of architecture. It is called as a two-tier architecture. So what do you mean by this two-tier architecture? So it must have an application through which the DBMS can be accessed. Clear with this? So there should be an application. So in case of single tier, so based on the design, I am just giving you a brief. You can visually imagine so what is happening. So in case of two-tier architecture, so it must have an application through which the DBMS can be accessed. And there is one more architecture. It is called as a three-tier architecture. So what do you mean by this three-tier? It separates its tiers from each other based on the complexity of the user and how they use the data present in the database. Clear with this? So all these are the different types. So based on my requirement, I can go for a single tier architecture, or I can go for a two-tier architecture, or I can go for a three-tier architecture. So what are all the different layers that are present in a three-tier architecture? So all these are the different layers. So I have a presentation layer or presentation tier. So I have an application tier and I have a database tier. So all these are the different tiers involved in the architecture. So what do you mean by this database tier or data tier? So the database resides along with its query processing language. So all these are the different tiers. The first one is called as a presentation tier. So next one is called as an application tier, and the third one is called as a database tier. So query processing language. What do you mean by a data tier? So at this tier the database resides along with its query language. So I'm going to define their data and I'm going to define constraints. I'm going to discuss with you about constraints. I can go for whenever I want to store some data, I can impose some constraints. I can that is pose some restrictions. I can go for primary key constraint, or I can go for foreign key constraints. So I can also have the relations that define the data and their constraints. So application tier. So it is called as a middle tier. So it represents an abstracted view of the database. It provides just an overview or an abstracted view. So end users are unaware of any existence of the database beyond the application. So application tier, from the name you can just understand. So data tier or database tier. So in this you can see how I'm going to interact query language. So they define the data and their constraints. An application tier, I can just view the database. It presents an abstracted view of the database. And the third one is the user tier or presentation tier. Clear with this? So at this layer, multiple views of the database can be provided by the application. Presentation, as I was telling you, right? So I have several departments. In a corporate company, you can imagine I have a sales department, I have an admin department, I have a marketing department, manufacturing unit, So whenever a person from different departments they are going to log in, he can view the database from his perspective. So when a person from a sales department, he is going to log in, so he can see what is the annual sales that is happening in the company. Clear with this? You can imagine, so what is happening internally. I am just giving you a brief overview. So what are the different tiers? So there are different types of architecture. So the first one is a one-tier architecture. Second one is the two-tier architecture. And the third one is that is three-tier. So you can see all these are the different layers that are present in the architecture. Tiers, or you can say them as layers. That is, I have a database tier, I have an application tier, and I have a presentation tier. So with this, I am stopping today. If you have any doubts, you can just ask me. I hope I am clear with my topics. If you are interested, you can go to InstaMojo and you can register for DBMS internship program, DBMS MC. This is the coupon code. Once you register for the internship, you will be getting access to the PPTs, the recorded videos, the project files, how the projects are being developed. You will be gaining more practical knowledge. Once you attend this masterclass for 25 days, you will be receiving a free webinar certificate. And the internship users, they will be receiving the internship certificate as well as a participation certificate. Any more doubts? Data models, I will explain you tomorrow. Whatever I can cover, I just covered today. Database, DBMS, database management system. So I'm going to manage the data. Database, it is the place where I'm going to store the data. Any more doubts? Yes, I will be discussing with you about SQL. Data models, I will discuss with you tomorrow if possible. So whatever I can cover, I will just cover. Any more doubts? SQL, you can use SQL tool in order to write any SQL queries. All right then. Yes, I will share the PPTs. Remaining things we will see tomorrow. Same time, same link. Thank you all.